Have you ever been pushed so far you can't remember where you were before they started pushing? Have you ever been set up for disappointment so many times you don't want hope anymore? In other words, have you ever been a Star Wars fan? Friends, let me tell you of my history with Star Wars. It all began when my parents decided we could watch Star Wars. My brothers embraced it immediately, but I, being especially young and stupid, was afraid to. Such cowardice. I grew curious about the new obsession my brothers were benefiting from, and I decided to give it a try. And I was hooked. I watched all 6 of the movies, thinking I liked them all. Really, I was in denial about how bored I was watching the prequels. I played a lot of Battlefront 2, Lego Star Wars, and The Force Unleashed, and I watched some of the Clone Wars. I eventually grew to hate the prequel trilogy for its bad writing, low comedy, and boring politician meetings, and I hated all of Star Wars by association. Such foolishness. Little did I know I was living in the good old days, before the dark times, before the Kennedy regime happened. I got a sense of false hope when they announced Star Wars Episode 7, which was made under new management. We were all worried about it being a letdown, but deep down, we all thought it couldn't possibly be any worse than the prequel trilogy. Star Wars Episode 7, The Force Awakens, released in theaters, and it had no originality. The plot points were copied from the original Star Wars trilogy without any understanding of why it worked in the first place, and every aspect of the Return of the Jedi's ending was annihilated. You remember the happy ending of Return of the Jedi that gave you hope with all of its wonderful promises? Well, forget those promises. The Force Awakens said, "Did you think Han and Leia would have a healthy marriage? Grow up. Did you think the Empire was defeated? There's no such thing as progress. Did you think that Luke Skywalker would rebuild the Jedi Order without the mistakes the old Order made? That's sexist." Thus began the great denial shared by many a blindly hopeful Star Wars fan. People were saying it's actually a good thing that Star Wars The Force Awakens copied and pasted its plot from New Hope, because they wanted to tell us that they're at least not copying the prequels. And people were telling us that it's fine for Rey, who had never used a lightsaber before, to beat Kylo Ren in a duel. It was a mistake for Rey to beat Kylo Ren in the first movie in the trilogy. I've heard multiple people defend the outcome, saying that it makes sense for Kylo Ren to lose that fight in The Force Awakens because he had been shot by a laser blast, and he was holding back against Rey. What those people don't understand is that it doesn't matter if it makes sense from an in-universe perspective. The first time Luke fought Darth Vader, he lost miserably. That set up Luke as an underdog who had more to learn, and it set Darth Vader up to be an intimidating threat. The first fight between Rey and Kylo Ren should have done the same. If the circumstances allowed Rey to beat him, then the circumstances were a mistake. From this point forward, Rey was a hero we couldn't worry for, and Kylo Ren was a villain we couldn't take seriously. The fact that he was shot just demonstrates the fact that there will always be some kind of foolishness around to make sure Rey will always win. Many of us, admittedly self-included, cut The Force Awakens some slack because we thought it was laying the groundwork for a good trilogy. But now we know it was laying the groundwork for The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker, so there is no longer any defense for The Force Awakens. Here's a few clips from reviews made soon after The Force Awakens released.
After so many years of people hating the prequels, these filmmakers had a lot to prove. So they had to demonstrate that they could do something that looks and feels like Star Wars before they could move forward with anything different.
It's the reintroduction of an old friend who's taken a beating and just needed to show that he's gonna be okay before he accomplishes better things.
So I can't speak enough about how fucking amazing the film was in terms of its looks, its practical effects. And it's a nervous excitement because this film was so close to the original that they kind of leaned on that. I guess we're going to find out in 8 and 9 when they have to get more ambitious, because they're not going to do Empire Strikes Back, a remake of that in the next film. People will catch on. They're not going to do Return of the Jedi in the next film.
I've heard some people say it's a turn your brain off fun movie. I can't say a movie hit so many emotions for me, and I actually started welling up in a few scenes, and they'll be like, yeah, it was total turn your brain out. No, those are two different movies I'm talking about if I do that. Their friendship was just done really well, and I'm looking forward to seeing that friendship grow in the next movies.
But in time, the sequel trilogy burned away our supply of denial.
Rise of Skywalker, from my viewpoint, is a mess. As this trilogy draws to a close, I can't act like I wasn't introduced to some interesting ideas, but they never felt anchored down by a clear goal.
It's the last film. It's over. They can't get this one back. This is what we get. And you know what? I put the blame squarely on Kathleen Kennedy, who is in charge of all of this. To stupidly go into a new trilogy without an actual plan. Welcome, my young Padawans, to the top 10 plot holes in Star Wars Rise of the Sky. I mean top 20 plot holes. I mean top 30 plot holes. I mean top 40 plot holes.
That's a lot.
in Star Wars Rise of the Skywalker.
Here we go. How did we get here? What happened? Like, what happened to Star Wars? What happened? Where are we? What weird alternate dimension am I in? Never seen a stormtrooper turn good. And what did they do with that? Not much.
If I had the power to travel back in time and prevent movies from being made, would I go back in time to prevent the prequel trilogy from being made? No, I would not. And here's why. No one can deny that the prequels were poorly written films. As movies, they were bad. But as expansions of the Star Wars universe, the prequels are crucially important. The prequels established a vastly different era in which Star Wars stories can thrive. The prequels established the Jedi Order and introduced clone troopers, along with several fan-favorite characters. You can't erase the prequel trilogy without erasing the Clone Wars, or LEGO Star Wars, or any number of games and other media. So no, I would not go back in time and prevent the prequel trilogy from being made. But I would go back in time and prevent the sequel trilogy from being made. In a heartbeat. The few things they used the sequel trilogy era for were rubbish. Star Wars Resistance? Rubbish. Video games? What video games? The only video game I can think of that spent any time in the sequel era was Battlefront 2, the EA version. And that game had microtransactions. And what about Galaxy's Edge at Disneyland? Oh, I've got some things to say about Galaxy's Edge at Disneyland. Can you imagine a section of a theme park where you get to meet all your favorite Star Wars characters, and everywhere you look, there's wonderful technology and references to events you know by heart? You can? Well, then why couldn't the people who made Galaxy's Edge? Instead of anything fun, Galaxy's Edge is a barren wasteland where you walk around a bunch of walls that look like they're made of dried mud, and the only characters around are from the worst trilogy. There's only 2 real rides, one of which is a glorified minigame with the most minimalistic controls you've ever seen. I would say it's as bad as Cars Land, but at least Cars Land was immersive. I exaggerate not, the most immersive part of Galaxy's Edge was the bathroom, because it looks like the kind of makeshift hunk-a-junk a Resistance member would use. That's actually not backhanded, nice bathroom experience. I would erase the sequel trilogy because it's not better than nothing. If we had nothing, we would have lived our lives thinking that the heroes that gave us hope didn't end up broken and ruined. For a while, I thought it would work to just pick and choose Star Wars content, watching, playing, or reading the good stuff while avoiding the bad stuff. But that came with consequences. Every time I liked an episode of The Mandalorian, I was given false hope that the right people would right the ship. But then they fired the best actress on the show and released a horrible third season. I kept hearing rumors that the villain behind all this, Kathleen Kennedy, would be fired for her crimes against Star Wars. But she still keeps her position after all this time. She created a box office bomb out of an Indiana Jones movie, and it was so bad not even she could deny it was garbage. If that doesn't get Kathleen Kennedy fired, I genuinely don't know what it would take. At this point, I think if she committed murder, they would let her run Lucasfilm from her prison cell. If I watch the good stuff, I'll get false hope, and that only leads to more despair. And even if Star Wars content is enjoyable, you can still see the terrible management's mark on it. Like in Jedi Fallen Order, the lightsaber doesn't actually cut through stormtroopers. No dismemberment, you just bop 'em. The mindset is apparently Star Wars fans can't handle the sight of dismemberment. I mean, it's not like the franchise is famous for cutting people's hands off. Not too long ago, they announced that they were re-releasing Star Wars Battlefront 1 and 2, the original versions, you know, the good versions. And that just makes me think, I don't trust you. There's some sort of monkey's paw attached to this in some way. The last straw was when they announced they were making another film about Rey. That spelled out that they're just going to go deeper into the same problems with no intention of changing course. You might think that I was angry when I heard this, but instead I felt an instant sense of total numbness. This was the point where I didn't care anymore. I don't have any expectations for Star Wars to course correct, and I don't want anything to give me false hope, only to take it away. I've heard differing opinions on the quality of the Ahsoka series, but I don't want to watch it no matter how good or bad it is. I haven't played Jedi Survivor, I haven't watched Bad Batch Season 2, and I might never watch or play them. They say that the opposite of love is not hate, but indifference. You can complain about Star Wars movies and series all you want, but the sad truth is, Lucasfilm won't mind having angry fans who still buy all their stuff. If anything is going to show Lucasfilm that they need to change their ways, it will be people who just leave. So I went sometime with a hole in my heart where Star Wars used to be. But then God appeared to me, and God said, "You do not need to live with this hole in your heart, nor do you need to suffer Kennedy's tyranny to fill it. I have something better for you."
With pride, I wear the symbol of my chapter and join my brothers. I am iron. I am wrath. I am doom.
He's beautiful. He's yours. Go forth and kill enemies of all the planets, killing them in the name of God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. And the Emperor, and Korn, Nurgle, Zinch, and Slanesh, and Gorkamork, and maybe even Sigmar. Forget Star Wars. I'm moving to Warhammer 40K, and I'm taking you with me. Welcome to a galaxy that never takes hope away, because you only hope for more war. Let's say, what if you know very little about Warhammer 40K? What is this stuff, you may wonder? Let me walk you through the basics. Warhammer 40K, as the name implies, takes place in the 41st millennia. But the explanation for what's going on begins in the 31st millennia. There was this guy called the Emperor of Mankind, and there's these suns which were actually more like science experiments, kind of clones because they were made with the Emperor's genetic material. Those sun clone things were called Primarchs, and these Primarchs used their genetic material to turn men into Space Marines. In case you don't know, you ever seen those huge metal-wearing macho machines? Those are Space Marines. For each of the Primarchs, there's a chapter of Space Marines. The various chapters of Space Marines have different characteristics and/or special skills. They got a bunch of planets with their billions and billions of people, and everybody loved the Emperor, especially the Emperor's favorite Primarch Horus. But then Horus didn't love the Emperor anymore. Horus fell in line with the Chaos false gods. It's not only that, he rallied half the other Primarchs to join him, and the Primarchs convinced the Space Marines in their chapters to join too. Those Space Marines are now called Chaos Space Marines. Those who follow the Chaos false gods are also called heretics, and thus began a war that has gone on ever since. Now, the Imperium of Man, with their Space Marines and their cyborgs, and their normal soldiers, might have completely wiped out the Chaos Space Marines by now if they didn't have so many other enemy factions to fight. There's Orcs, Tyranids, Eldari, and more. Those factions I just mentioned all fall under the category of Xenos. Xenos are not human, which means they must all die. Or so the humans say. Did I mention that the Imperium of Man is kind of evil too? And most of the reason why is their religious policies. You see, the Emperor never wanted to be worshipped as a god, but he's been unable to tell anyone that for a while. Ever since his final battle with Horus, the Emperor has been hooked up to a machine that keeps him kind of alive, but mostly dead. Sir, the troops want to burn the non-believers. Should we let them? You're right, what could possibly go wrong? The great thing about the Imperium of Man being kind of evil is that you don't need to feel guilty about killing them while playing as the other factions. Every faction in Warhammer 40K is varying levels of evil. Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Knight, isn't that kind of bleak? I thought we were mad at Star Wars for being miserable. Good question, but I have a good answer. It does not feel bleak. Warhammer 40K is not depressing the way Star Wars is. The concepts of Inquisitors that can blow up planets if there's too much heresy, Eldari and humans hating each other because their superiority complexes are the same, and wars that last over 10,000 years. It's all just too ridiculous and over the top to be sad. Especially when you know that the Imperium of Man does not deserve sympathy. The tagline for Warhammer 40K is, "In the grim darkness of the distant future, there is only war." What better way to tell the audience that the goal is not to make the galaxy a better place by ending the war. The goal is to relish the war. When the planets explode, you will feel no sadness. Because those who live in the Warhammer 40K universe exist to die for your entertainment. You might be afraid of a politician who cheated his way into an all-encompassing dictatorship, but you're not afraid of hilariously dumb orcs who use jetpacks fueled by the power of imagination. None of this madness is any danger to you. You don't live in a world where chaos, false gods tear holes in reality. You don't live in a galaxy where even the least evil nations still have slavery and a kill the non-believers policy. In the grim darkness of someone else's future, there is only fun. Meanwhile, Star Wars began with a film called A New Hope. The original trilogy told us a story of a bunch of goofs faced with impossible odds. Luke was someone who we could relate to, someone who knew he wanted to go places and do something huge, but didn't even know what that looked like at first. Luke was dropped into a situation he didn't like, with a family that wouldn't last, then tasked with fighting an empire too big to fight. But Luke never gave up. Luke learned skills and fought the powers that were until he had changed the galaxy for the better. If someone so like us could beat the odds like that, maybe the odds against us aren't as impossible as we thought. Psych! Luke didn't accomplish anything. The Empire was never gone. Somehow Palpatine has returned, and Luke has been wasting away on a rock waiting to die because he tried to kill his nephew and got his students killed. If someone so like us is such a loser, maybe the odds against us are impossible after all. By the way, you are now considered sexist. That is depressing. Let me get preemptive about a counter-argument that could be made against me. Someone who knows a thing or two about both franchises might say Warhammer 40K can't be a full replacement for Star Wars because Space Marines have no sense of romance. Sure, Jedi are discouraged from attachments, but that just means they do forbidden love stuff. How can a franchise without romance replace a franchise with romance? Good question, but did the Star Wars movies ever have good romance? I recently released a video called The Romance in All Three Star Wars Trilogies. I originally wrote the script for that video as part of the script for this video, but then I decided it was big enough to be its own video. In my opinion, Star Wars doesn't have a very good track record in terms of romance anyway. I mean, yes, I would like them to change the rules so that Space Marines can have romances, but the lack of romance in Warhammer 40K doesn't really put them at a disadvantage. So now that we know definitively that Warhammer 40K is a replacement for Star Wars not only suitable, but also necessary, what do we do about that? I have a few Warhammer 40K recommendations. Keep in mind that this is not an extensive list of every piece of Warhammer media worth having. This is what I have read and played in my young experience with Warhammer 40K and would recommend based on that. I think that Warhammer 40K Space Marine is a great introduction to Warhammer 40K. The combat is a combination of hack and slash and third-person shooter. I made a video called In Warhammer 40K Space Marine There Is Only Fun. In that video I played Space Marine and I also talked about the lore and a few other things here and there. There's a ton of stuff that I talked about in that video that I didn't talk about in this video, so I think that the two videos as a whole are a good introduction to newcomers to Warhammer. Another game that I liked, albeit not as much as Space Marine, was Bolt Gun. It's the Warhammer 40K version of a Doom clone, with the pixelated graphics and the number of weapons you can carry around. A game that I've played some of, I've gotten sidetracked and I've been thinking maybe eventually I'll go back to it, is Rogue Trader. It's hard for someone of my sensibilities to get into. Rogue Trader is a turn-based strategy game, a genre which I have not played that much of. But it's definitely an acclaimed game. I'm sure people with different sensitivities will have an easier time getting into it. At some point I'll go back to it, it's just that I have other stuff I'd rather do right now. And on the book side of things, I recommend Brutal Cunnin. It revolves around orcs attacking a forge worlds inhabited by Adeptus Mechanicus. Adeptus Mechanicus are basically cyborgs, and the narration is very good at adopting the mentalities of the two factions as it switches between them. There's a ton of action, there's a bit of comedy here and there. Really good book. So remember to like, comment, subscribe, ring the bell, and choose Warhammer 40K over Star Wars.